Hello, beautiful people. Welcome to Searching for Dragons. I'm Snappy, and I'm joined by my co-host and good friend, Graham. How are you doing, Graham?
I'm all right, thanks. How are you?
I'm doing great. I've been super excited for this episode. So this is our follow-up to episode 5 that we did with Gast Bouschet and on their work, Anarch. And this was a book that was really meaningful and impactful to you, and it was your choice. Do you want to talk about Anarch and its impact for you?
Sure. So, to me, when I discovered it, quite by happenstance, well, Arto led me to Anarch in a roundabout way, and pure magic, and it was just spoke to me as a profound tome of sorcery and philosophy and posthumanism, and just reading the book really enriched my life.
Yeah, it
You
had
know.
a really profound impact on you. And then it's also had a deep impact on me, engaging it through this show and then reading it. I've ordered my own copy, and it's just this incredible amalgam of magic, art, philosophy, poetry. And it's just a really profound, incredible work that I think just about everyone in our audience needs to engage with. If you're interested in the stuff that
Mhm.
we're talking about, Gast is a modern voice that's bringing this kind of magical and sort of chthonic perspective to the fore in a very profound and direct way. And after we did that episode, you told me that Gast was on Instagram, and that's how you had reached out to them and asked if it would be all right if we did this episode, because we were going to be going quite heavily through their work, and of course we want to make sure that that was okay. And I decided to go on to Instagram, and I hadn't been on Instagram since I started my transition, and I just went on and I liked a couple of his things, and then he reached out to me because I guess he saw the name and recognized it, and we started up a conversation, and it was a very deep and profound conversation. We started to talk about philosophy and all other kinds of ideas about sorceress practice, ritual practice, and I really wanted to do an interview with Gast, but unfortunately, because of their current situation, they're disabled. They were unable to do a traditional interview that I would do on my show, where we, do an audio back and forth through live video. But we figured that we were having such a profound dialogue through text that we should try to engage through writing of actual like answers and do like a proper text interview, and that we could read it on the show. So I took that conversation and sort of distilled it into questions, and then added some other questions and got your impact. And that's what led us here today. So what we're going to do is we're going to go through the interview we did with Gast, and it's sort of about, so this is the man himself, Gast Bouschet, and it's about, basically I wanted to ask him about his thoughts on sorcery, on magic, on politics, on artistic creation, all the sort of stuff that's interrelated to Anarch, and as well as a couple of different themes in Anarch. So the way we're going to do this is, here's his book here. I wanted to show you that. You can all please support Gast, and if you're interested in purchasing this work, there's a link to the publisher Scarlet imprint below. And you can also find Gast's Instagram if you want to go chat with him. He's very active on Instagram, and he's happy to engage with people. So please reach out to him. And if you reach out to him through our show, let him know. And we'll just get started with the questions. I'm going to read the questions. Then Graham is going to read his answers. And then we're going to kind of talk about it and respond. And I'll also kind of give some background to some of these questions as well. So the first question we had for Gast was, how did you become engaged in occultism, and what drew you initially to alchemical practice, and what separates your work from classical alchemy? So I really wanted to know, like, I'm always interested in how people come to this kind of understanding, or come to these practices, or get engaged into the occult world, because it's such a niche and occluded part of society. It's something that a lot of people either have disdain for, or something that people aren't likely to see unless they are of a certain kind of character. And I also wanted to ask him about alchemy because it engages so much of his work. And I probably should have phrased this one a little better, but with classical alchemy, but Gast gives us a really detailed response. So
Yeah.
you can
So, all right. There was something like an initiation experience. When I was 9 years old and my grandfather, who had died the day before, was laid out in the neighboring room, I had a nightmare from which I woke up brutally when a black stone lying on my chest suddenly began to pulsate with flashes of light and then fell into me, pulling me into an inner black hole. That night, drenched in dread, and the strict Catholic morning rituals my family went through for a year took their toll on me, and I almost didn't grow for the next 3 years. A decade later, I realized that I had dreamt of what is called the Black Sun in alchemy. The first image of it is probably printed in the treatise Philosophia Reformata, which I also had tattooed on my body so that I would carry it with me as a living sigil until my death. When I was in my early 20s, I went on many LSD trips, which brought back what I had experienced as a child and sometimes dragged me even deeper into this abyss. Horror and ecstatic joy are very close to each other with this drug and sometimes even merge at high doses. In smaller doses, LSD enabled me to experience my physical access to the world in a completely new way. At the time, I saw Castaneda's first three books as a guide to the life of a sorceress warrior who always has death an arm's length behind them and who must pass tests by going beyond what is generally considered possible. Having previously been involved in sports at a fairly high level for 10 years, including being a national champion in judo in my age group, doing high jump and long jump, and playing handball in the junior national team, I was in good shape in my 20s and had mastered tasks on LSD, such as quickly crossing a stream by jumping from whetstone to whetstone at a great speed. Or I would go hiking in the forest at night, sometimes in difficult weather conditions and in complete darkness, to face the blackness and encounter the demons living there. With or without drugs, I put myself in a state of mind that, with a little goodwill, could be compared to that of a sorcerer's warrior. Such a view, of course, romanticizes what I was doing, what I was capable of, and I was very lucky not to break my neck, but it was incredibly empowering at the time to physically do things that I then saw as necessary steps on the path of sorcery. After those wild youthful years, I became more cautious, but the physical approach remained throughout my life until I had an accident in 2017 that put an end to it, or at least redefined my physical connection to the world. I had often shot my videos in harsh conditions, working in toxic fumes on volcanoes, climbing into caves, or crawling under glacier tongues where sometimes heavy chunks of ice would break out next to me and it could have killed me. Danger and seeking out demonic forces in the wilderness have always been an essential part of my work, and I have done my best to convey this in the images themselves. Without it, I don't think it would be possible to make sorcerer's art, which always has posed a threat to be labeled as such. Classical alchemy is a vague term, as alchemy was practiced on different continents at different times, and there is no standardized definition for it. There are practices that are summarized under this term, but they can only be compared with each other to a limited extent. Be that as it may, I am trying to update alchemical thinking and practice for our century, which is characterized by an unprecedented relationship with nature, a nature that we have changed so much that has little in common with what can be called natural. But nature is a problematic concept in itself, because it is characterized by our view of the planet, which actually says more about the people who look at the world than about the world itself, and which really only refers to the fungal infestation that covers the planet's crust, as Schopenhauer once put it. In any case, what we can call fungal infestation has been significantly altered by us in a kind of black magic that poisons our living conditions and those of the other beings with whom we share the planet. I associate this planetary poisoning with the personal suffering that manifests itself in the chronic pain and disability that plagues my body. So there was a kind of inner and outer alchemy at work in my art. But actually, the toxic black alchemy I am talking about here is only one aspect of what I understand by the dark sacred. At the center of my work is a primordial blackness that is the womb and tomb and chaotic seed of all possibilities. And it is important for me to emphasize that this blackness is ever present and was not only there in the beginning. Blackness is the living substance of the universe, which is active in both the infinitely large and the quantum small. My art is about nourishing this blackness and channeling its creative potential into my artworks. Only when I succeed in this can I speak my art as black alchemy or alchemical sorcery.
Wow. So I just wanted to show this picture here. So this is the image that Gast was referring to from the Philosopha Reformata, the black sun. So I imagine he has a variation of this that has been tattooed on him as a personal sigil. But let's go back here to the beginning of his answer, because I really wanted to talk about this idea of the black sun, which is really a profound thing, because I'm not as familiar with alchemy, but within the Greco-Roman tradition, the black sun is Saturn Kronos. It is Dionysus. It's that the sun as it's entered into the underworld, and that brings that chaos, that revelry, and that freedom. And also, when I think of this image of the black stone coming down, I often think of the image of the Omphalos, which is the stone of Uranos that Saturn cuts from his father, that then crashes on the island on one of the Greek islands. And also, I think of the black stone of the goddess Cybele, right, which is what she is worshipped, and also all of the various black stones, these meteorites that are at the center of much of pagan worship, and this idea of drawing down the stars, which is so essential to our channel. What do you think of the black stone, Graham?
The black stone, I mean, I'm not super familiar with a lot of this imagery, but what came to mind was the black stones that Artaud refers to in his book Heliogabalus.
Right. Can you elaborate on Artaud's perception of that?
He doesn't really have his own particular perception, but he mostly goes into talking about, well, I guess it's his perception, how these sort of cultures discovered these black stones and became central relics or holy objects to their religions, and how they ascribed much like sorcerous magic to these stones.
Right. And oftentimes these would be tektite. If you look here, I wear a piece of tektite on me permanently as often, except for when I go to bed, as a representation of Saturn. And Saturn, and this idea of the black stone, and was a huge personal thing for me and my own experience of the occult and of magic worship. I originally began with Saturn worship. And then that perception of Saturn led me to this personal hermitage and this personal reflection upon violence, which eventually brought me to the other half of Saturn, which is his consort Rhea, the Great Mother, which is now my main deity that I'm engaged with. And so this is really, I find, a profound image, and something that's really deep and personally important. And so that's really cool that he had this kind of connection with the black sun, I thought. And also, I really like this idea talking about the LSD trips, because many of us who have engaged with the magical world or occult practice have had profound drug trips that have then led us to exploring more altered states, whether it was through additional drugs or through meditation or ritual or what have you. I know personally it was my experiments with cannabis and with mushrooms that really pursued me in this direction. And I know, Graham, you've had similar experiences, have you not?
I've had some pretty interesting LSD experiences in my life, one of which involved walking through a blizzard in like a t-shirt.
Wow. Wow.
So I related to when he's talking about, exposing himself under the influence, into like exposing himself to a harsh condition to sort of like feel like a visceral connection to the earth almost, you know?
Right? I often find that intense drug trips are a traumatic experience, and then it's a forced perception of the other. And it forces you into this world that no longer makes sense. It distorts your perception, it distorts your relation to the body. And through this, you're able to perceive and recognize things about yourself that you couldn't have in other states. And then with me, it led me to deeper practices of meditation and other forms of practice. And now I'm able to do a lot of the same kind of drug experiences without as much drugs or any drugs at all often. And it's something that's, I find, really profound and necessary often. You know, in many of the in the early Greco-Roman religions, right, the drugs are central to the rites, you know, and it's a way to engage with the natural world and to transform oneself and to perceive. So it's really profound.
It is. And that's a way that I've tried to relate, I guess, my psychosis to the world, you know, because it's very much like I don't really need to use LSD. I kind of just experience those sorts of things in my daily life. And I've tried to see them more as like opportunity to learn as opposed to something that's inhibiting me.
Right,
But
because you're naturally in this state where you're constantly perceiving these other beings, this other kind of this disconnection from the body, which often, like I know in my own experience, it normally requires deep meditative focus upon an image or upon a practice, you know, but for you, it's a bit different.
Mm-hmm.
And then I am this idea too of the transformation of the self and his unfolding and transformative view of sorcerer's practice as he's aged is something I also relate to. I know we're far younger than Gast, but this has become really apparent to me in my middle age as I've now begun a personal transition and have become far more receptive of myself and the divine and this idea of divine imitation that is essential to my own personal practice. And how has your relationship to this kind of practice changed over time?
I mean, it started off with when I was a lot younger, one of my brothers and I would have deep talks about the nature of the universe and being, and I came to a lot of conclusions that I firmly believe in now, but I stopped believing in for a long time because of trauma and illness. And my discovery of Artaud and my journey with Artaud was really what rekindled my desire to engage with those types of philosophies, but from a more magical perspective, which is really quite new to me. But like I've been aware of the existence of these rites from studies, but I've never really been as immersed in them as I have in the past year or so.
No, I totally understand. In my conception, I was so immersed within religion and within sort of frameworks in this search for sort of a truth, and I really had that shattered as I started to pursue the more chthonic sort of practice, and I recognize the more material, the more natural, the more dark side, for lack of a better term, of a lot of this kind of practice and engagement. And this is something I really related, this idea of trying to connect with the black substance of the universe, of trying to go into that infinity, of connecting to the all, that which is beyond perception and meaning. This idea of the being and non-being, where everything kind of breaks down and you get that true perception of the other. So much of my personal practice is about this, about engaging with this and trying to draw down this otherness into myself and become transformed by it. And this really seems to be at the heart of Gast's artistic expression, where he's trying to engage with this other and then through this reception create something meaningful out of the natural world, which is really beautiful. And I also really relate to this idea of failure and this constant striving to try and do this, because it's almost an impossible task in many ways. And even when it is achieved, it's not fully achieved. It can never be fully achieved. You know what I mean?
I know exactly. Like a lot of my poetry is incantation, you know, like I don't think that it really, you know, it's I don't think I've fully actualized it yet. It's just something that I'm practicing.
It's an imagination. Well, so much of magic in this kind of sorcery is about imagining something better, about creating a new world, about projecting into the future, and about self-transformation. And we do this through that active engagement. Poetry is a way for us to redefine the self, redefine practices, and to move forward, right? And I see your art as this very deep, visceral expression of the self, but then this desire to transform the self, which is really beautiful. So,
Thank you.
all right. So, well, now we'll get into George Bataille. So, this is someone who is really influential on my current conceptions because for so long I had been invested in religion and spirituality, and I had a hard break with traditional concepts of the spiritual world from a Western perspective. And for a while, I even identified almost as atheist because I had this perception of hard materialism. And it was someone like George Bataille who really kind of provided me with this framework to approach the material reality in a magical and occulted way, and to still have this kind of mystical reception and an approach to the natural world without going into these false spiritualisms that are largely, constructs and made up, or lies meant to control, or false moralities. And Bataille, I really first approached him through his religious studies work, because he's written so much on so many different topics, and he was really perceptive in the understanding of religion and connecting it to this need to deal with the reality of excess, and how do we process and deal with this excess abundance, and how we're able to relate to this. And so much of art, true, real, profound art, is in the waste. It's in the expenditure of energy for nothing else other than the perception of it, for beauty's sake. So it's kind of this really, in many ways, this black art, this dark magical production. And I really struggled with this for a long time, being in these more traditional religions, which were all about trying to achieve this perfection and trying to remove oneself from the artistic world, from life, from affirmation, and trying to ascend to something greater. And Bataille gave me the framework for which to dive deeper into the material, into the natural world. So I really wanted to get his perspective because he referenced Bataille in his work, and Bataille was so important to me. So I asked him, you mentioned in your book the works of George Bataille. What are your thoughts on his conception of immanence and humanity's inability to return to a past continuity, one free of disconnection? And what I'm referring to here is sort of a core idea of Bataille's work is that, and this is essential to Gast's work as well, and he referenced it in his last answer, is this a reality that we basically, humanity is this evolved form of life where we can't we now perceive ourselves as removed from nature. We see the natural world as an other, and this is definitive to our language, to our perception of reality. And Gast didn't believe it was possible to ever return to this kind of golden age, the Saturnian golden age, this time when we were directly connected to the reality of the natural world. Bataille talks about how in his conception, Eve biting the apple is really representative of this othering, of this severing of the self and the natural world, and seeing ourselves as other, which led to so much science and creation. But it's this fundamental disconnection. And while we cannot return to a time prior to this disconnection. I believe it's so important for us to acknowledge the disconnection and to try to fight against it, to try and perceive ourselves as one with nature and one with our creations, and regard our creations as synonymous with the natural world and not separate from it. And this was really something that was profound for me. So I wanted to gain Gast's perspective on George Bataille in this understanding of disconnection.
Right. So what Gast says is that from a sorcerer's point of view, it is important that we penetrate the deeper layers of being through visionary work, which also means a regression in time to the primal human and beyond, into the animal and even bacterial and microbial, to finally end up in the black primordial matter. Bataille's satanic conception of base matter, which opposes the betrayal of nature committed by the Christian religion in which I grew up, is important to me. I see in his base materialism the continuity you mentioned, Nietzsche's Urein, or primordial oneness, which I locate in the chaotic depths of the chthonic universe. The encounter with base matter is like falling into an abyss. In the context of black alchemy, Bataille's idea that matter is an active principle, especially in its decomposition, also seems important to me. At the moment of metabolic meltdown, all the demonic cosmogenic force contained in the flesh is discharged in a dialectical expenditure that reworlds the world. The idea of reworlding the world has made a lasting impression on me. Bataille also explored the art of transmuting fear and pain into joy, at least temporarily, which has always appealed to me because of my experiences as a young man, which has taken on a much greater significance since my accident after having to live with chronic pain. It's not about being lulled into false hope. Hope can be a terrible enemy when you can't permanently change a condition for the better, but about going into the depths of pain and fear and standing in what he calls a solitary darkness, in an attitude without the gesture of a supplicant. This attitude without the gesture of a supplicant is that of the sorcerer's warrior that I have been striving for since my youth. If you will allow me, I would like to conclude the question on Bataille with a quotation from him. I myself stand on various peaks that I have climbed sadly. My various nights of terror collide. They multiply, they intertwine into these peaks, these nights, unspeakable joy. I pause. I am a cry thrown back. I collapse.
What a profound quote. And so this is George Bataille here. Before we get into that, I want to just talk about this quote because it's so profound from the traditional kind of religious perspective of this, especially within, Western European classical alchemy of ascending the holy mountain. Those familiar with that movie, The Holy Mountain, will recognize this image as well. But it's this idea of trying to ascend beyond and achieve this almost godhood. And he talks about even at the times when he ascends to the highest of peaks, it's intertwined with the night. It's not inseparable from it. And even in these moments of unspeakable joy, there is a cry to disillusionment, to destruction, and he collapses back down. And there's no separation from this. So this is truly important for me because so much of my personal practice had to be about a rejection of this ascent, understanding that this is not the right way to go. I reject the mountain. I'm not interested in climbing it in any sense. I want to dive into the depths, and through the depths, I ascend to the heights, because as above, so below, and it's this recognition of the temporality of these moments and trying to instead reaffirm life in the cycles of death and rebirth. And that has to be this unfolding of dying, this unfolding of the collapse, and an embracing of this. And Bataille understood that deeply, intimately. If we look here, this is Bataille himself, but I included this picture from one of his famous magazines called Asaphael. And Bataille, this magazine was something he did with his friends, but it was where he would write about sociology and religion and philosophy, but it was also a secret society that he had created. And the purpose of this secret society was actually to destroy Bataille. He wanted to be offered up as a virgin sacrifice, to be decapitated, and to attend that absolute destructive force where you ascend to the absolute heights, and at that moment of ascension, you are destroyed. And he felt like this would be something beyond profound. And if we go back where he's talking about here, where this idea of Bataille, where he's talking about just the idea of engaging with violence and with pain and transmuting pain into joy. So we see in Bataille's work, he often would talk about, like, there's this famous image that he had put up in his house, and it's of this, it's called Lin Chi, which is a form of Chinese torture. And he had this image of a man undergoing Lin Chi, which was death by 1,000 cuts, where they would slowly cut you with paper cuts. But if you look at the image, the man is crying out in ecstasy as well as pain. And Bataille wanted to reach that plateau where you were uniting these two forces, the absolute joy and the absolute destruction. And he felt like this was that transmutation where you create that balance of these two forces and are thus reaffirmed in life and in death. And it's this ultimate conflation of the two into a unified form. Just really profound stuff. And, you know, Bataille was a dark man, but someone who was at the same time a staunch, hard materialist, someone invested in the scientific method, but also deeply occulted and mystical. What do you think about that, Graham?
Something that I learned when I was something that one of my professors talked about when I was in horror literature in university in my course was that the experience of the sublime is a mingling of awe and terror.
Exactly. We see this so often in the religious context. You know, when I was in India doing my studies, there was a couple times, and I was a young man and or young person, and these things really shocked me. At the time, I witnessed these yogis and these sadhus who would be engaged in these acts of self-destruction. I remember seeing there are these people, they call them the dancing bubbas. They never sit down, and they allow their legs to atrophy. And you would see them in various stages. I saw some bubbas where their legs were all swollen and pussed, and others where they had shriveled up to the blackness and had become sticks. And they would hang themselves from these ropes so that they wouldn't have to sit down even in sleep. Or I saw this one yogi who had stretched his arm out until it had atrophied. Another one who had taken his penis and mangled it around the spike, and he unfurled it in front of me and started waving it around like a whip while screaming out vitriol and attacks. And this is like the sadhus, these particular sadhus are engaged in the truest forms of the left-hand path, this practice unto death, this deep disassociation with the world, and this recognition of death and destruction. And I also even think about like images of the Buddha. If you look at the Buddha, before he came up with the middle way, the Buddha was practicing the Jain religion, and the Jain religion is really about this asceticism and this denigration of the flesh through aesthetic practices, through controlling what you eat, controlling your movement, and this idea of the flesh almost becoming like pasty, because they have this idea of karma pugala, where karma is like a physical matter that holds you down. So in order to ascend to the heights, you have to like shed off this matter. So they'll even talk about how as your skin becomes translucent and more white, you're ascending to like this higher stage. And the myths of the Buddha, Gautama Buddha, I should say, of Gautama, they tell us that he practiced this to the point of almost death, where he had racked his body and he had become like deeply starving. And his moment of enlightenment comes when he collapses under the Bodhi tree in front of this river, and a young girl, and this is in some of the stories, not all of them, but in one story, this young girl comes and nourishes him with milk, and she asks him, do you want me to save you? And he gives up his pursuit and drinks the milk. And it's in that moment of allowing someone else to help him of admitting his frailty, that he achieves his enlightenment. And it's also like, I was talking to my friend who is a neurologist, and a lot of these monastics and yogis and sadhus, when they engage in these destructive practices, it becomes pleasurable. They're transmuting the pain into pure pleasure. They're in these states of ecstasy. And they're often engaging in drug use as well. Like the dancing bubbas would do this right, where they'll smoke these chillums, which are mostly cannabis, sometimes would contain opium. And they would also, as a ritual, people could go through and smoke with the dancing bubbas, and they would give you tilak. They'd put tilak on the sign on your forehead. So it's such a truism that even the most intense religious practice is this self-destruction. In order to engage in the awe, you have to confront this darkness, right? Look at the description of things like angels and demons, right? Even the angelic beings are horrific, and they inspire this deep fear, right?
Be not afraid, right?
Thing, And I just really love this idea too of the primordial oneness, and locating it in the chthonic depths. And it's this encounter with the base matter, this encounter with your physical reality and the limitations and the reality of your own death, your own limitation and your own destruction, and the embracing of this, and in becoming one with that transmutative process of death and rebirth. Really deep stuff. Any last words about Bataille?
Just his passive part of Gast's answer when he says Bataille explored the art of transmuting fear and pain into joy, at least temporarily. And then he says it's not about being lulled into false hope, which can be a terrible enemy when you can't permanently change a condition for the better. That really speaks to me as someone with like a chronic, uncurable condition. Nietzsche said hope in reality is the worst of all fears because it prolongs the torment of man, right? And in some situations, it's not about hope, it's about strength.
Yeah.
And willing to look inside yourself and find that power to move forward in the world and with the world.
In spite of the pain, right? This is something that is really deep because, all life is going unto the end. And even those of us who do not experience illness as we all will eventually experience this decline, this decay. And we have to confront this at some point in our lives. At least we should confront it in order to really embrace the totality of our experience, in order to be able to continue to persist in life, right? And in this affirmation of the process of life and death, rather than hide from it. Like I went to the depth of a lot of religion and almost became a monk at one point. And so much of this stuff, they want you to disengage from the world and sit in utter darkness and do nothing, and even control all of your thoughts so that it's only on worship of this other. You're supplicating your will, you're supplicating everything into this path of unto death, and it's so debasing and unrewarding and ultimately unfulfilling, and all for the promise of potentially reaching someone else's experience, whether it's a Christ or a Buddha. And in my own practice now, I ultimately reject that. I want to experience life to its fullest in the ways that I can. And I want to reaffirm life in spite of the suffering, like often, the Buddha talks, life is suffering, but life is also love. And there's only the experience of love in this material world, in this life. There's two sides to this coin. Like you can't experience one without the other. To love something is to ultimately to suffer for it. And I think that's a profound thing, and we need to embrace that suffering and that ugliness that comes with these things,
Definitely. Artaud says to be in pain is not to suffer, but to survive.
Well said. Beautiful, beautiful. So let's go into this next answer here.
Sure.
So this idea of the Anarch is something that's really at the heart of Milton's Paradise Lost. I actually had been very reluctant to engage with Milton just because I had such a visceral break from Christianity and from a lot of Christian mysticism. But what you see with Paradise Lost is that it's attained this sort of mythical place within the modern mindset, and it has been, it's been transmuted and engaged with in multiple perspectives, and it is something that can be truly profound. And even though it is a Christian text, it doesn't have to lead to Christian idealism. We can look at it from multiple perspectives and engage with it. And this is something that I had to personally learn. It's been a big learning experience for me this year. And this idea, too, of the Anarch as this rebellion, this rejection of the law, the rejection of hierarchy, the rejection of order, and the embracing of change is something that's truly profound, and it's at the heart of my own practices and my own philosophical beliefs. And then this idea of the Saturnian, of that figure that was destroyed and otherized, completely brought low and rejected. Like, this is something that I find really profound and that it needs to be talked about. So I really wanted to get Gast's perspective on this. So I asked, your work is titled Anarch, and there are references to Milton's Paradise Lost. Can you talk about your thoughts on philosophical anarchism and the concept of the Anarch and its relation to Saturn?
And so Gast says, Milton is perhaps the closest to my sorcerer's idea of chaos, in that, on the one hand, he addresses the anonymity of multiplicity of embryon atoms that are constantly fighting for survival within the eternal anarchy of chaos, and on the other, embodies this chaos in the paradoxical figure of Anarch Old, which is helpful when working magically to give a face, so to speak, to the power we are dealing with. I don't know if I would describe myself as an anarchist in the historical sense. I am cautious when it comes to collective struggle for common goals. I think that basically only individual existences are real, communities of whatever kind are illusions that are also mostly ideological. But perhaps this is the true anarchism. Bakunin pointed out that political anarchism rises out of our animal essence. In any case, my thinking can be described as anarchistic in the sense that I believe that the universe itself is chaotic or anarchistic, and I reject any form of hierarchy in the exercise of power, as far as this is possible in relation to all living beings. But of course, this is doomed to failure. I fight viruses and bacteria with drugs like everyone else when they make me sick and threaten my life, and I feed on animals and plants. We live in a predatory universe in which survival can only be guaranteed if beings kill other beings. We have to live with this existential guilt that we humans are part of the collective murder without lying to ourselves, but reassuring each other we are on the right side of the divide between good and evil. The virus is not evil. It fights for survival. Although the status of viruses is not clearly defined and they are thought to exist somewhere between death and life, an intriguing idea that would be worth exploring further, but never mind. Viruses try to survive in some ways just as we do, but I'm not telling you anything new here. The leap from Anarch to Saturn is a bold one, but let me try. I think that behind the figure of the mythological Saturn is chaos. However, I'm not sure I would go so far as to call Saturn himself an embodiment of this chaos as we do with Anarch. Saturn is often referred to as the guardian of the threshold between the known and the unknown universe, which is probably due to the fact that the planet whose name it bears is the last one we could see with our eyes before the telescope was used to observe the night sky. But the figure of Saturn appears in many mythologies, European, Arabic, Jewish, Indian, and probably some more, and I didn't want to reduce it to one meaning. To a certain extent, I also find the vision of the planet Saturn from the point of view of the Fraternitas Saturni exciting, because as with the black sun, it involves the alchemical marriage between light and darkness. They see Lucifer, who embodies the light, as the higher octave of the planet Saturn, and Satan, who embodies darkness, as its lower octave.
So I wanted to include this image from Paradise Lost. This is Lucifer's fall from grace and him being thrown into the world and into the underworld eventually. And this idea of anarchism is something that is really important to me, because for so much of my life I identified as an anarchist and was involved in a lot of activism, and I still identify with it to a certain degree, though I'm no longer political in my struggles or in my personal relations. And now I think about these things in more philosophical terms. But this idea of the rejection of hierarchy and the struggle to try and live in a loving, connected relation with all living beings without violence, even though it's doomed to failure, is deeply important to me, and is something that I've really resonated and struggled with. So to listen to Gast talk about these things, and also come to similar conclusions about communalism and communities, and how, well, on one hand, it may be a noble struggle, and it's something that I believe we have to do to a certain extent. It's also an impossibility, and it's also an inability, right? Like true direct democracy is almost an impossible idea, and these political frameworks that come out of politics ultimately always betray us, and they always lead to another kind of violence and another kind of control. And now I'm really about trying to get to this freedom and an acceptance, and learning to live my personal life and to affirm life in my own ways, and to challenge hierarchies, and to reject elements of social control. What are your thoughts on philosophical or political anarchism, Graham?
I mean, I'm not super well versed in it, but personally, I also take a more personal path. I'm very much like aligned with Artaud in the sense that I don't really believe in political ideology. I think it's more about a transformation of the self, and I think that everyone needs to strive to go through this transformation if society itself is going to change.
That's something that's truly deep. I think that this is where I'm at now, where I want people to engage with the reality of the natural world, which is anarchistic, and it is without law. It's without these impositions. It's this natural unfolding, and it is fundamentally chaotic and about survival, and it's individualistic too. And when we recognize these things, and we recognize these other attempts as simply human created attempts, it's a life affirming process, and it's a understanding of the struggles, and it takes it back to this immediacy of the self, and it allows one to move in a way beyond guilt. I find so much of modern politics is about this guilt, and it's about this, we're unable to in many ways act in a truly meritorious or compassionate way with the world. We live in a world of violence, in a world that's defined by this separation, by this Saturnian element that's deep, and it's something that we have to struggle with and learn to overcome. I do have in my own personal philosophical grounding this idea of the creation of the Temple of the Muses, of this foundation that will allow us to persist and allow us to overcome, things like blood libel and whatnot. But it's such a complicated thing that I don't, I also recognize I'm doomed to fail in this pursuit, as much as I must strive for this pursuit. And it's such a complicated thing. I was also really interested in how he brought up the Fraternitas Saturni, which is a Germanic occult school, or occultism. It's like a brotherhood, the initiatic brotherhood, and they are notorious for having a very kind of staunch view of Saturn, and this embracing of the chaos, and this embracing of overcoming and becoming this individual, and using the magic to affirm one's individuation and to struggle with the natural world. And it's a pretty profound thing when they talk about Lucifer and Satan as these elements of Saturn, because we even see that within the ancient Greek, from which a lot of this derives, even before the alchemical ideas or the Fraternitas Saturni, because we have to remind ourselves that Apollo, from which Lucifer derives, is one half of the solar ideal, and the other half is this Dionysian, and they're in this constant cycle, as Macrobius tells us in the Saturnalia, where, you know, or Nietzsche talks about this Apollonian and this Dionysian kind of duality that exists. And we have to remind ourselves that Dionysus is Saturn reborn, right? Saturn is Dionysus's grandfather, but Dionysus is representative of the same energy, but in an evolutionary context, where he has evolved from the mistakes of the past and has been reborn into the world, and is trying to reclaim and bring back that revelry and that anarchism. And I think about, like, this time of year, we're about to engage in the festival of Saturnalia. And Saturnalia is all about how we're going to be entering the solstice, the moment when we're at the darkest point. And this is when that Saturnian element comes to the fore. And what does Saturn bring? He brings equality, brings the harvest, brings abundance, brings this wild, exuberant joy, where the structures of the old world and work and everything have to be abandoned. And we return to this natural state of wildness and revelry. And it's a really profound idea, I think.
It really is.
So anything else to add about this kind of idea, the anarch, and engaging with anarchism or Saturn?
I don't know what else I could add to it that would just be a regurgitation, so.
Wonderful. Okay, let's continue. Oh yeah, I just wanted to show this Greco-Roman picture of Saturn, because often we regard Saturn as solely this evil figure devouring his children. And
yeah, but he's
remember
really a bountiful harvest god here.
Well, he represents the wild, chaotic exuberance of the past, of that natural world, which is violence and will devour you in one sense. That's why he's holding the Ouroboros, which devours itself and recreates itself in this unending cycle, right? Mm-hmm. But from that violence comes the abundance, right? You have to reap what you sow, you know, and he brings justice and he brings this violence, but that violence also creates abundance. And that same violence allows us to maintain this freedom and this revelry. So it's a very complex understanding of this image. And the Christian world is really denigrated and dismissed Saturn and misunderstood, I think, in many ways, what's going on here. Mm-hmm. So this was something that I really, I've talked about already, because of this idea of, I went through this personal rejection of spirituality. I do use that term sometimes, but I don't mean it in a Western sense. And I really wanted to get his opinion on these things. So I asked Gast, throughout your work, there is a rejection of Western spirituality and there's a professed hard materialism. Can you discuss your perspectives on spirituality and materialism?
To put it in a nutshell, I think that matter is everything that exists, but that it is so mysterious that it has little in common with what we generally understand it to be. The spiritual takes us away from what we call nature and brings into play the transcendental, which is somewhere beyond earth, usually in heaven. I can't relate to the concept of the spiritual. It's too airy and not earthy enough for me. I'm too much of a Nietzschean who whispered to me that I should stay true to the earth. I think we in the West gave up something essential when we elevated ourselves from the animistic substratum to the transcendent. It is unfortunately very ambiguous to speak of animism today, because the term is tainted by the colonial thinking that still characterizes us today. But I cannot think of a better term at the moment that would more accurately describe what I mean. So I use it with the caution I emphasize here. In the case of my practice, I should also call this animism sinister animism, because as I've already mentioned, we are dealing with a world in which the natural of nature has been destroyed, though probably not yet to the point where the earth can no longer exist. The question that arises is the one that you, Snappy, raised in one of our earlier conversations, namely whether humanity will survive this great change. I will leave that question open.
So I just included here a picture of the classical Christian apocalypse. But I think it's a very profound image because every apocalypse is a revealing. It's a time for when knowledge comes, but it's also a beginning and an ending. And every apocalypse is a potential final end. And while it won't be an end in the natural sense, the natural world, of course, will persist. It is greater than humanity. The question remains whether or not our species, humanity, will persist, or whether we will be transformed into something unrecognizable from us, or whether our entire animal clave will just disappear and will be replaced by something else, or maybe we'll transform into birds and become minor players on the natural world scheme. You know, we've created a world in which there's so much disconnection, and we've poisoned the natural realm and caused such an upset that I question whether or not we will ever be able to overcome this, especially when I look at our current world and the current mindset, especially of those who wield power and their complete disregard and unwillingness to change. You know, they refuse to acknowledge the world. They lie to us about it constantly, and they'll do anything to hold on to their power. To me, this is truly a Saturnian thing in that classical Greek sense where they are becoming the tyrant. And then even this fear of their creations, like the fear of AI or the birth of AI, and this wanting to consume it and to relegate it and to enslave it. This may bring about our end as well. It's hard to say whether we destroy the universe or destroy our world and make it uninhabitable to us as we currently exist, or whether our creations wipe us out for our enslavement and disregard of them. Either way, this is something that we're going to have to face in the coming centuries, if not in a much more immediate future. You know.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think, Graham?
I think, I mean, I always, I came from a background that was Jewish, but it was not forced on me. We were invited to engage with it at our own personal desire. And then over time, I started, in school and stuff, I started reading a lot more philosophy and other religions and stuff and spirituality. And I became more of a Spinozist in the sense that I believe that the universe itself is the all,
Yeah.
and that the spirit of the all is in everything. And that really is at the core of a lot of my beliefs, I think.
Right. And this really relates to what he talks about here with animism. And we've had this discussion in many of our talks. We just recently talked about this in regards to your poetry. And this is something that's essential to both of our thinking, that life itself is alive and is conscious, matter is conscious, and that consciousness is inherent to matter, and that these things we need to recognize the import and the deep lives that are around us, whether they're animal, virus, or even material, and even the things that we create. None of this are without this kind of aliveness, consciousness, for lack of a better term, and I agree largely with Spinoza, right? The universe is fundamentally alive. And it's unfortunate too that so much of animism, we've in colonial thinking and in modern religious thinking, all of the various so-called, for lack of a better term, I hate this word, but primitive spiritualities or religions or philosophies are relegated to the realms of animism. And it's a denigrating thing. And we use that as this very ambiguous term that starts to lose meaning. But I really like this idea of engaging with the natural world as being, as alive, as something to offer, as something to convey, even though they may lack language or understanding in the conventional sense of humanity. They are as much alive and as worthy of being regarded as we are. And this is something that is essential to my perception of divine images and the use of ritual and the connection with ritual objects. because through these objects, through the material, we can perceive the other, because that which is other is material. Like these things have, even this talking through this medium of the internet and of the computer, right? These things are all alive that facilitate this for us, and they have a will, and it may not be perceptible, but I believe it.
Right.
So yeah, and this is a deep question. Will we survive? Will humanity persist as it is, or will we be remade into something new that's unrecognizable from what came before?
Mm-hmm.
So I noticed in a lot of Gast's work, a lot of it is really embracing of a lot of African spirituality, or sorry, I should say African traditions and Voodoo, and it seemed to have that kind of African expression. And when I was talking with Gast, he noticed on my Discord, because I've been so influenced by Caribbean ideas, and specifically Jamaican music and a lot of African expression. We started talking about that, and that led us to this deep talk about Africa and Voodoo, and even this idea of animism in the general sense, and in the idea too of cultural appropriation. So I really wanted to engage with him on this, and Gast really provided a wonderful answer. So I asked, can you discuss your connection to African traditions, your perspective on Voodoo, and animism in general?
And he gives a stellar, profound response, as to be expected. He says these connections are based on personal experience. I need to expand a little to shed some light on the context. I have worked intensively with African artists and curators since the late 80s of the last century. At that time, I met Fernando Alvim, an Angolan artist who had founded a center for contemporary African art in Brussels, where I was living, and who was very keen at the time to create a road between the two continents, on which, as he pointed out, you could travel in both directions. This center, which existed in various forms in Brussels until 2005 and was later relocated to Luanda, was an international meeting place for artists from Africa and the African diaspora. I spent nights talking to many of these artists and intellectuals, and about topics as diverse as neocolonial politics and the influence of the Nkisi spirits. Some inspiring relationships developed, for example with Simon Njami, who now plays an important role in contemporary art and is currently involved in the selection of the curator for the next Documenta, and who wrote a brilliant article about my work, in which he even went so far as to claim that my work in South Africa had made me an African, whatever that means. I exhibited my work half a dozen times at Camouflage, as the center was called in this late phase, and traveled to some African countries back then, to Egypt, which is all too easy to forget is an African country, and plays an important role if you have an alchemical practice. Because the roots, at least of one of the best known forms of alchemy, are in Africa. One should also make more connections between Voodoo practices and alchemy. Suzanne Preston Blier does this in her book African Voodoo, but otherwise, little reference is made to it. I have worked in Ghana too, where I explored the influence of religious imperialism in the trust files. This work led to my participation in the first Luanda Biennale in Angola. South Africa has been a major influence, which I visited several times and where I completed a residency that led to an exhibition in Johannesburg, and later to the publication of a book dedicated to this work. However, the work on my video installation Collision Zone, with which I represented Luxembourg the 2009 Venice Biennale, and in which I juxtaposed African immigration movements with the shifting of tectonic plates, seems to me to be the most significant. It revolved around the political and geological tensions in the Mediterranean that are literally turning this region into a collision zone. I experienced some of these tensions firsthand when I was arrested in Quetta on the Moroccan border for illegally filming there, and could literally feel the paranoia that Fortress Europe has to militarily secure its borders. As you can see, there are many connections to Africa. It's also important to mention the proximity of my sculptural work to Voodoo. It's a troublesome thing with such influences, because most people nowadays immediately assume cultural appropriation when you mention them. But as my Angolan friend said, the motorway goes both ways. And if you don't mind Africans adopting European working methods, you shouldn't mind Europeans doing the same with African ones. We have often talked about Oswald de Andrade's Cannibalist Manifesto, the basic idea of which is that Brazil's history of cannibalizing other cultures is its greatest strength. We are all cultural cannibals. But I don't think we can adopt the strategies of other cultures one-to-one in other contexts. We have to make them our own and make something personal out of them. However that may be, I have tried to find out as much as possible about the sculptures called boshios, which play a central role in Fudan. They help me to get a view of art objects that is not exclusively characterized by their aesthetics, but by the materials that these objects are made of, or that are added to them to give them a magical charge. In addition, the transience that comes into play in boshios is a central element of my work, especially that which I developed here in the Ardennes forest. Sorry if I butchered pronunciations of any of these words.
Yeah, no, yeah, exactly. We're Westerners, and we do our best, but yeah, I think it's Bokios, but
Okay.
we may be wrong. So this is a picture of Fernando Alvim, one of the artists that Gast mentioned at the beginning. He also talked about the two different art curators and one art curator and an art historian. But here's a piece that I found from Alvim's work that I thought was really profound and just
It's very striking. It immediately reminds me of The Projection of the True Body by Artaud.
Yeah, wow. And it to me, it really, you get this kind of a decay of the form, of human form, and the crying out of the human form and the chaos. So I thought this was very reminiscent of some of the works that Gast was doing, so I wanted to include it. And here are some traditional Vudan bokios. And if I didn't include any of Gast's sculptures, but if you look on his website or if you get the book Anarch, you will notice that many of his living sculptures, which he embeds within the forest of the Ardennes and then photographs and allows them to undergo that decaying process, are somewhat related to these similar figurines, and they're definitely related to that sorceress practice of imbuing them with life and engaging with them as living beings, as living others. So something really, really beautiful. Mm-hmm. And I really just want to talk about, I loved how much he engaged with the African world and how he allowed these African ideas to truly become part of his work and become part of his perception. And I absolutely love this idea of the Cannibalist Manifesto and acknowledging that we are all cultural cannibals, because so often people are, we do have to be worried about cultural appropriation and of misunderstanding other people's works and denigrating them and or stealing them. Like, this is something that does happen. But at the same time, we have to acknowledge that this unfolding exchange of ideas is a natural process of human evolution and human cultural adaptation that we cannot avoid. And we have to do this in a loving exchange where we take from what we learn from the others and allow it to transform the self. And through transforming the self, we recreate the self with that in mind. And I really see Gast's work as an extension of these African Vudan sculptures and an extension of his European background, rather than an appropriation, right? This is something that he's created that is uniquely his own and of the self. And it directly relates to his experiences in Africa and these incredible relationships that he had with these amazing art curators and people throughout his time there. And it's important that we acknowledge this. This is something that's really at my heart, because, well, when I went to India, I really identified with many Indian ideas, and I have incorporated them to my own, but I would never identify as a Hindu or try to take them solely as their own, right? I try to incorporate them into my own perspective and make them something new in my own perception and allow them to radically transform me. I am deeply influenced and deeply humbled by the Indian tradition, and I have no expertise and no willingness to speak for them in any way. you know. And I think it's important, like we can have this loving appreciation and an adoption of other methods and other ways without it being appropriating, you know. But it has to come from a dialogue, and it has to come from a dialogue of connection and of respect. It's funny, I was just watching the movie The Nightmare Before Christmas with my partner, and we were engaging with this film, and we were both kind of just amazed. It's one of the best. If you want to see the wrongs of cultural appropriation, watch The Nightmare Before Christmas.
Yeah.
And they lay it all out without coming out and just saying it, right? Jack goes to Christmas Town and he perceives Christmas, but rather than engage with the people there, he makes his own assumptions and tries to claim it as his own and tries to engage in the holiday. And by the end of the film, instead, Snow comes to Halloween Town, and they profess that they're going to hold their own Christmas in their own way for themselves. And he becomes inspired, and he's going to take those ideas and transform Halloween. And that is that cultural cannibalizing, and it shows both the awfulness of cultural appropriation and the beauty of this cultural cannibalism. Sorry, it was a long answer there, but what are your thoughts, Graham?
You know, I'm very much on the same page. It's all about a syncretic view where you sort of formulate your own personal philosophy from your own other influences, right? Because you can really only understand something in relation to how it relates to you. And we only really understand ourselves. And you can engage in the dialogue and understand the context for these different things, but ultimately it comes down to how has it shaped you.
Yeah, right. And we have to allow the works of other cultures and other peoples to transform us because it's an inevitability at the same time. You can't perceive the other and not be transformed by it. And if you do it in a way of mutual respect and understanding and conversation, then it becomes a beautiful thing rather than resisting this or denigrating it or stealing it, you know, which is often the methodology that has been imposed in the West, you know?
Yeah, I see it more as like the ideal would be sort of like bacteria where they link and exchange genetic information, you know, and then they carry on their way. Forever changed.
That's a beautiful way to put it. I really like that analogy. That's wonderful. Yeah. Okay, so the next question I wanted to ask Gast about was one thing that really stood out to me when reading Anarch was his radical inclusiveness and the rejection of traditional ideas, and his anarchism and this progressive, I don't want to say progressiveness, but radical inclusiveness and this acceptance of the other. And that was something that I found truly beautiful, and is something that I really look for in art, especially as someone who's often otherized and excluded because of my sexuality and my transness. And this is something I truly loved about Gast and his approach to the occult and to magic. And it's unfortunate because, he's not unfortunate. The occult world is unfortunate because so often it's related to far right politics and to this rejection of the other, and this establishment of traditional forms, and this obsession with a magical past that never truly existed, and this idealism, this rank idealism that is just something that's so frustrating. So I asked Gast, can you discuss the politics of your work, the radical inclusiveness and the rejection of traditionalism, and your thoughts on the current occult landscape in terms of politics?
Seem to have lost my place, so I'll read from here. I always see sorcerer's art as political art. I always see sorcerer's art as political art that aims to undermine control mechanisms. I think that everyone should be active in their own fields, and in my case, that was the art world for decades. Today, my work is more likely to be located in so-called occulture, but I still oppose the diffusing of art by institutional politics, which prevents us from challenging the system that makes cultural institutions possible in the first place. In everyday dealings with contemporary museums, the problem usually manifests itself in the fact that if the institutions have their way, art must always be there for everyone and must not offend the supposed sensitivities of the public. The aim is to make art appeal suitable for families. This demand prevents us from working radically. But I should say what I understand by political art, even though my heart beats more to the left than to the right, if such distinctions still make sense today. I think that political art should not be expressed as propaganda for one side of the political spectrum or the other, but results from the question of whether we act independently or rely on the help of institutions to achieve something. And political art manifests itself in the materials we work with, in the way we proceed, and in the goals we pursue, which should never be based on ideological thinking. Sorcerer's art is a revolt against those who are in power and can therefore define what is real. As an example of my working method, I would like to mention a large video installation such as Metamorphic Earth, which are recently renamed Satanic Earth. In it, I put a curse on the financial world in the city of London. I worked with volcanic ash and dust, which I collected after a volcanic eruption in Iceland, and then smeared on the camera lens along with rainwater and once even dirty snow when it snowed heavily in London and all air and rail links were disrupted. The work took several years to accomplish and involved engaging with meteorological forces and the chthonic forces of the earth that gave the curse its potency in the form of black volcanic dust. Such actions turn my work into sorcerous and political art. Sometimes I cast a spell on the art world with large, expansive installations where I take part in biennials and museum exhibitions, and sometimes I resort to largely unnoticed guerrilla tactics. To give another example, I often disguise occult attacks as art, such as when, together with noise musicians Yannick Frank and Xavier Dubois, I bombarded the facade of a prestigious museum, which was filled that evening with bankers and other members of high society, with demonic light and sound vibrations. Our goal was to trigger seismic molecular events in the architectural concrete and glass and bring the damn thing down. We didn't succeed, of course, but our sorceress attack disturbed quite a few people that night. The technicians we were working with at the time were baffled as to why we were pointing the wall of loudspeakers at the museum and not at the small audience who were brave enough to join us in the cold rain to watch a performance while high art was being celebrated in the swanky museum. I will not be able to do justice to the complexity of the issues surrounding so-called traditionalism, but as I am sure you can see from my explanations, I am very critical of them. My work is directed against the hierarchical and right-wing thinking that makes up a large part of the Western esoteric tradition and still feeds and underpins authoritarian social systems today. The idea of a spiritual renewal towards transcendence is fundamentally at odds with what I consider desirable, and the whole philosophical and religious system that imagines a celestial hierarchy from the Godhead down to the lower animals is suspect to me. My thinking is not pyramidal, but horizontal. To express the main problem I have with the traditionalists, I dug out a quote from Hakim Bey. You can't say it more accurately. Of course, as we know, the problem with the traditionalists is that they were never traditional enough. They looked back at a lost civilization as their goal, religion, mysticism, monarchism, arts and crafts, etc., whereas they should have realized that the real tradition is the primordial anarchy of the Stone Age, tribalism, hunting-gathering, animism, what I call the Neanderthal Liberation Front.
I absolutely love that quote. That blew my mind when I read it. And I was not fully familiar with Hakim Bey or Peter Lamborn Wilson, and I will have to engage with them because that just was so wild. And it really does sum up so many of the issues that I have with traditionalism. They don't go far enough. They don't go back to a true the golden age, right, of that Saturnian connection with the natural world. And also this idea that the traditionalists have of this magical past that never existed, and these hierarchies, and this obsession with connecting all of these disparate religions into one universalism, this universal morality that can be weaponized and used as a colonial weapon to destroy people. And we've seen that. We've been there. We've lived through the Crusades. We lived through the jihads. Time is enough for this stuff, right? We need to get rid of that BS. And also, these traditionalisms, they make no room for people like me. They make no room for people like you. Those of us who do not fit into their moral frameworks as healthy working members of the cog are demeaned, dismissed, and degraded. I rebel against traditionalism with every fiber of my being. It's something that's really, that really irks me, because I was confronted with so much of this when I was studying religion studies in university. Many of my professors were traditionalists, and they would try to bombard me with this BS about how, Islam was this amazing tradition and it was all connected, and all of them were connected as this one universal church that just wants to worship some masculine father, and we all need to submit. The works of people like Rene Guénon and his whole lot, I reject it. I think it's absurd, and I want nothing to do with it.
Fair. I think that Gast really touches on it in Anarch. He mentions it here, the Stone Age, but he talks about in Anarch how Neolithic people would go into caves to divine insights about the world and themselves, about returning to that primordial blackness.
Yeah, going back to the cosmic wombs. Often these caves were imagined as these wombs of the Great Mother. And it was this return to the beginning of creation. And from that place, you could then profess creation outward. You were reaffirming life through the cycles of life and death. The cave is this scary, deep, dark blackness, but it's also that primordial beginning. And it is in these dark recesses that we're able to ascend to the highest heights, I believe. And you're right, this is at the heart of the Stone Age and these more so-called primitive peoples and these primitive workings. And this is what I am all about. And this is what I'm interested in. And I was I was so amazed. And I just want to talk about Gast's cursing. What profound magical action. My heart goes out to you, Gast. The fact that you cursed the London financial institution, that's pure gold. I absolutely loved it.
It's beautiful.
Satanic Earth, this whole entire project I need to go and dig into more. And
yeah, working with the volcanic ash from the eruption is just like, it's fantastic. The amount of time and work put into crafting this magical act.
Political, magical, cursing. It's so beautiful, and it's profound, and it is a truly, truly amazing approach to sorceress art and sorceress ritual. And kudos, absolutely loved it. And then the fact that you were bringing that Gast brings in the sorceress magical workings into these places of high society in order to tear them down. I just love that. And then they subjected all of these bankers and these, rich people to such demonic noise and that destruction. I love it. So often the art world, these places are modern temples, are modern, but not in the traditional, not in the ancient sense, in this prestige place where you take art and you enshrine it in a place of high prestige, where it almost becomes about the prestige placed upon it than the art itself. I think about pieces like the Mona Lisa, which is nothing special. It is almost the story and the fact that it's famous that makes it more famous.
Give me some Edward Munch,
you see those pictures of all those thousands of people scrambling over each other to get a picture of something that's been photographed 1 billion times, and they ought to be in its presence. It's become this religious relic, and it's just kind of a parody to me. It's so silly. So I love that he challenges these institutions and that he engaged in this magical working, directing the speakers at the walls of the museum itself. Beautiful.
To shake the foundations of the institution. So good.
So good. And this idea too, Hakim Bey, Peter Lamborn Wilson, returning back to the Neanderthal and this mystical anarchism, love it. Gonna have to engage more with his work too.
Definitely.
So the next question I had was, a central theme of the work Anarch is it came out of his accident and the fact that he had to reorientate his life, and that he decided to reject sort of modern society and engage with the forest and return to this place in the Ardennes, and to try to separate himself and become a hermit, to engage in the hermitage. And I really wanted to get his perspective on this, because this was something that was really important for me personally, was to disconnect from the communal religions and the communal ideas, and to not allow these people to influence me, and to really go into the self and to reflect upon the self, to understand and to gain my own unique magical perspective and accept it, and to even understand myself without being constantly bombarded and controlled by the external world and people's perceptions of me. And this was such an important thing that finally doing this allowed me to accept myself and to engage in this transformation that is essential to my magical practice. So I really related to this going into the hermitage, and I really wanted his perspective. So I asked him,
Right.
Can you discuss your perspective on solitary sorceress practice? Why it is necessary to separate oneself from greater society in order to create transformative living works of art?
The conditions under which I work today are the result of a combination of several factors. My accident was a final element in a series of events and considerations that led to the way things are now. Let me start by saying that sorcerers have always been outsiders in society. The methods they use are not suited to being illuminated in the glare of the midday sun. They are at home in the twilight, and sometimes they cloak themselves in the darkest night to perform their art. Solitude is important to achieve the necessary focus without which no powerful art can be created. I am convinced that the jet set life that many successful artists lead today will sooner or later cause their art to suffer. This is one of the reasons why so much anesthetic and mediocre art dominates exhibitions today. Artists are selected according to how well they fit into the curatorial mold set by the powerful museums, who are always beholden to the patrons behind them, whether they are corporate or state-owned. If it were a question of the work itself, most successful artists would have to cower in shame. The art world has lost the sense of tragedy and depth without which great art cannot exist. Most people sense this intuitively and simply don't feel addressed by contemporary art, which really only appeals to those who somehow belong.
So I wanted to include this picture from Gast's work Anarch, and this is of his hermitage in the Ardennes forest, where he went into his somewhat solitary confines, where he could engage in his black alchemy. This is such a profound answer, because it really gets to the heart of a lot of the problems with the contemporary art world. And he recognizes too how most people can't engage with this, because art has become more about the art history. It's more about creating new trends and creating new, it's no longer about the art itself, but it's about how you create the art. And it's about this radicalism. It's like Dadaism run amok to the point of absurdity, where everything has become this parody of itself. And all of these people are engaged in this production of new techniques and new methods, but they don't understand that the people who were radically innovating were building upon traditions, and they were trying to create something unique and of the self, not necessarily trying to create a new mode or method. And often these modernist pieces where it's just paint on a wall or a piece of banana taped to a wall, or it's just, it's something that's radical for the sake of being radical and loses all its radicality. It loses all meaning, and the average person can't even connect to it. True art should be profound, should speak to you, even if it's abstract. It's not about the process of painting. It's about what the painting says. You know, it's about the totality of the whole. I understand the beauty of the method in which art is constructed, but if you make art solely about the method, then it starts to lose any meaning. And if it's always about parody, if it's always about deconstruction, you're not constructing anything. You're not saying anything, you know. And now this has all become codified into this function of selling things, where all these artists want to sell their stuff to the highest bidder in order to become famous, to create products, you know. What do you think, Graham?
I think a lot of this is quite true. As an artist or creator of art myself, I don't really do it for fame or attention. I do it because it helps me stay alive. And if it happens to speak to someone as well, if it happens to speak to somebody, then that's great, and I've achieved its purpose, you know? Maybe, or maybe his purpose was just to speak to me. It's hard to say. It depends on the piece, right?
Right.
Um, but
That's
ultimately,
really
if you get too like you said, if you get too caught up in the process and the deconstruction of what it could potentially mean, you lose the power of feeling its energy.
that's such a profound thing you said too. So oftentimes the art is not for anyone else but the self. Like I often will, major part of my practice is body percussion. And this was really a big struggle for me because for a while I was doing that professionally. I got to perform on television, I got to perform in festivals, I did commercials, and eventually I had to just reject it. I couldn't do this thing that was so deeply of the self and was for me, and it was about entering into these ecstatic states for the greater world. And I do engage in it sometimes, you know, for fun and silliness, but I don't ever show the truly meditative practice that I engage in on a daily basis, because it is not meant to be engaged with. It's not meant for the outside world. It's meant to be a transformative process within myself, an engagement with my body and a shedding of my body. It's art for the sake of me and for the sake of the divine. And it is a conversation I have with the divine and not anyone else, you know?
Exactly. When I do a lot of my vocalizations, like my throat singing, and I incorporate a lot of that into my meditation and like movement to into my meditation, and I use incantation, and I don't really talk about this with anyone, like the specifics of it, because
Right.
it's too like important to me, and it's sacred, and I feel like it'll lose its magic if I were to replicate it for somebody.
Right. And this is something you see the Gast talks about and struggles with in their work, because so much of their sorceress art is not meant to be seen. It's not meant to be perceived by the outside world. It's of the living forest. And they have created a way in which it can be partially perceived through photograph, but people are not invited into that realm of the forest where Gast has installed these things and engages with them in a deeply personal way. You know, and I so relate to that. Like my altar where I do my sorcerer's practice is private. No one will see that. Maybe my partner when they come here, but that's, you know, it's on a very deeply personal level. This is something
Mhm.
that's of the self and for the other, for that divine creation, right? Like I have created images of the goddess in my own way, and they're not meant to be. It's for the goddess, it's of the goddess. And this is something, its sacredness and its holiness is somewhat achieved by its removal from society, and the fact that no one can perceive it but me. You know, if you were to see it, it's all located within a box, and I unfold the box, and that's my Saturnian cube, you know, and I keep it all relegated inside. So if it even is perceived by someone who comes into my world, they wouldn't even recognize it for what it is. You know,
Right.
I do always have the goddess present with me, Kali, you know, in her form as Kali, but this is a mass produced piece of imagery. Even though I bought it in India, and this particular piece has meaning for me in an individual sense, it's a mass produced art object that's meant to be consumed. but I still want to have that presence of that radical destructive force in my videos, so that people perceive her and have to engage with her, you know. But Kali is only one aspect of that great chaos, of that chasm, of that ultimate mother energy that's beyond even gender, right? That's beyond any kind of conception that I can even hold. So any artistic creation of that essence is a limitation, and it's an attempt. It is an attempt at dialogue, right? And it is an expression of the self more than it is even of it or her, you know.
Definitely.
So yeah,
Definitely.
this is something that I really relate to. So I really loved this answer. It was, and you know, I feel like we have to take art back for ourselves. We have to take art back for this creation of something. Like, some things are meant to be shared too. Like, I'm currently working on a book of poetry for you in your publication house that I want to share with people, and I want to engage with others. But it is something that I've purposely set out for this reason. And it is not about making money or anything. It is about expressing a philosophical and a religious ideal that I hold, and that I think that others will benefit from. So much of life, I believe, is meant to be communicated. Like, we are the infinite universe sharing with itself and engaging with itself in this unfolding, you know. And I learned from others, and I believe I can share with others and teach them, you know, in ways that they understand, right? Like, it's not for me to decide. I create the art, or I create the poetry, and then other people take it and run with it. Even my conceptions don't really truly matter, right? And if I fail to convey the meanings I set out to, then that is a failure, you know?
Yeah, and failures are like important. You know, we fail a
Yeah,
lifetime, countless times in a lifetime, right? And they're always learning opportunities.
right. And I don't mean it like, even though it would be a failure, the meaning it holds for someone else is a real, and it is profound,
Hmm.
and maybe it's profound for them, even if it's not the meaning I intended, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, the Ardennes. So now we come. Oh, sorry, we got two more questions. So I wanted to really ask Gast about artists and things that he's worked with, because I wanted to discover more artists. Like, we discovered Hakim Bey, and I'm sure we're going to find some more here. So I asked Gast, what artists and piece of art have you found truly impactful? Are there any works or artists that you can point that are engaged in a similar process of Black alchemy that your work is presenting?
The door to art was opened to me by alchemical illustrations and artists like Munch, whose images of illness and death made a deep impression on me. The influence of other artists takes place mainly in youth, and there were key moments, such as Punk's attack on polite society in the 70s and the DIY ethic he cultivated, reading Hakim Bey's Manifesto TAZ and his concept of poetic terrorism in the 80s, or discovering the photographic work of Sigmar Popke and recognizing the violence he inflicted on the material he worked with. But perhaps the most important role was played by Joseph Beuys. How do you pronounce that?
I think it's Boyce.
Beuys, who gave me the impetus to take the role of the materials with which art is made seriously. His art used to be very controversial, and he was denigrated as a Schmutzmagier, dirt magician, on various occasions. I don't know how he took it, but I always saw it as a compliment. Which inevitably brings me to black alchemy, which draws its materials from the poison and filth of this ecologically ruined world to hex those who use glossy brochures to distract from the evil strategies they are pursuing. So I owe a lot to Beuys, but my sorcerer's art is darker and lonelier than his art was. In response to your question as to whether there are artists who practice a similar process of black alchemy, I have to admit that I find it somewhat difficult to come up with many names. Those who engage in such things do so on a theoretical level. Few have a practice in which they live what they read or write in books, and even fewer use their dark arts as a force of insurgency. There were times in my life when I felt I had allies in this regard, and there are still some today, but their ranks are thinning. I greatly value the long and varied collaboration with Alkistis Dymek and Peter Gray that led to the publication of my book Anarch, among others, and what I've been working on this year with Harper Feist and Frater Acher has great sorcerer's potential, but we'll have to see where it takes us in terms of the politics and poetics of the other. Most of the troublemakers I've shared the road with have now made themselves comfortable in the art world, and some of them have even become celebrities there. Others have given up out of frustration, and quite a few have burnt out from drugs or died. We are a generation born after the Second World War, and I don't know why that is, but many of us have waged a war against our own bodies. I got my shit together just in time, but with a little less luck, I wouldn't be here today to answer your questions. In any case, I keep my eyes open to find those who create corrosive sorcerous art. Due to my disability, I can no longer physically meet with people, but I recently shed my aversion to social media and now show my work on Instagram and share ideas there too. It's not the worst platform to express yourself outside of the control of art institutions. And since you asked what I found really impressive, I have to emphasize the collaboration with musicians like Steve Kaspar, Yannick Frank, and Stephen O'Malley, and the power of music in general. I've seen a lot of concerts, and some of them, like his Sun concert, shake you to the core. I've been lucky enough to work with Stephen, who along with Greg Anderson forms the core of this band, many times, and we've performed together in places like Taiwan and Norway in the Arctic Circle, which has certainly caused a rift in the universe. By the way, there were northern lights that night that we stared into together after the live performance. It is also worth mentioning that I was involved in the so-called black metal theory a good decade ago and published my photos in the 3 issues of Helvete that appeared at the time. There were brilliant minds in this scene, and the subversive ideas on blackness and demonic noise we formulated back then still influence my practice today.
So this is a photograph by Sigmar Polk that I wanted to show, and you can really see where the influence would come on Gast's work, the decaying of the body and the destructiveness of the paper and the photographs itself. And I just thought this was a truly stark image and something that needed to be engaged with.
Very, very evocative of Munch, who we also mentioned.
Right, Munch with the scream and whatnot, and that's also really interesting because I grew up, and I know you, Graham, as well. We both were deeply influenced by radical music scenes like punk and metal, and for me, ska and reggae, and for you, more black metal. So, and we'll go through his artists here, and we can talk more about black metal in a second.
Sure.
Here's Boys. This is an installation he did, and what's really interesting I thought about this piece was the tent and it really almost looks kind of sorceress, like a sorcerer's hood. And this is a piece that was meant to be engaged with. The wolf or the coyote here would pull on it, and there are different pictures of it. It was almost a performance art piece that Boys was engaged in. And here were 2 other pieces I really liked. This one, a sculpture of a female form, and it's almost in decay. And again, it really reminded me of Gast's art. And then this painting in its simplicity and also in its reception of the human form, I found really moving. And it seemed to come of the self, and it really reminds me of that, what he said about the dirt magic, this creating things from the dirt, like this could almost be the red ochre of earth,
Yeah.
And then included here, this is an image on the left of Alkistis Dymek and Peter Gray, who are often co-collaborators and are both practitioners of thelemic magic and sorcery, and are well known in the occult community. These are 2 people I haven't fully engaged with, but since talking with Gast, I'm going to reflect upon them and engage with their work. I've had this kind of conception about Crowley and a lot of the things that are descended from Crowley, and I've kind of had sort of an unease with it, but I'm reconsidering that. So much of Crowley's philosophy I love. Do what thou wilt, and love under law, do what thy wilt, in this whole concept of this radical freedom, and also his idea of utilizing the scientific method through the pursuits of religious practice. And I also
Mhm.
really engaged with his tarot, but that's more because of the art of Lady Frida Harris. But it seems like Gast has worked with a lot of these thelemic artists. Harper Feist is here on the left, and we engaged with her poetry through that interview that she did with Gast in the Goetia online. And they have an upcoming book that sounds incredible that I think I'm going to have to purchase once it becomes released. And then on the right here, this is an image I took from Scarlet Imprint. This is what they had in place of an image for Frater Asher, who I believe is maintaining their anonymity in their practice. But Frater Asher is someone you've engaged with. You have their book, Holy Daimon.
I have Holy Daimon and Holy Heretics. I haven't finished them yet. They're next on my list. But
This is,
I'm about halfway through Holy Daimon, and it's fascinating work.
the Daimoness is something that is deeply important to my work, especially because its connection to the ancient Greek world and this idea of the possession and connecting with this. The daimon is kind of interrelated to the concepts of the muse, and as well as the concept of the holy guardian angel you see within Thelema and Crowley's work. And this idea of this other self, or the self that exists outside of time, that has
Mhm.
gone through the cycles of death and rebirth until the final destruction, and can engage with you and lead you along this path. And its life is sort of a dialogue with this other form of the self. And this is something I deeply relate to, because I find like the self is in this like everything is in a constant state of flux, and that there are multiplicities to the self. And I know you, with your mental illnesses, have had to engage with this in a more profound way than many other people have. Just
Definitely,
that
definitely.
radical other. Um,
Yeah.
Here's a picture of Sun, and Sun is a band that we absolutely love.
I've been fascinated by them for decades.
As a bass player, I first found out about them because of their bass amp worship and their love of Sun amps. If you notice the symbol at the end of their name, it's the logo for Sun amps, which was the
Yeah.
first manufactured electric bass amp. And I love this feeling that you get from heavy drone music, where it pulsates within the chest and it almost causes a visceral reaction.
Yeah.
Heavy metal in general has this way of disconnecting one from the body, from shutting out thought, and providing almost this immediacy of life, I find. What do you think?
I mean, I've seen Sun in concert. I saw them they performed inside the Hearn Generating Station in Toronto.
Oh wow, that would have been really
And it was one of the coolest experiences I've had. And they played for over an hour straight without break, and just this droning constant force, extreme volume levels too, and you can feel the vibrations. Every atom of your being is in vibration with this curse that they're casting on you, almost, or this spell. And you can feel your body connecting to the music, and you almost dissociate and like have this transcendental experience through their music.
I need to perceive that live, because that just sounds so incredible. And hearing Gas talk about working with some of these musicians and others in that live setting, that would be something truly magical. And what I really love about Sun is their engagement with the magical. They dress up as wizards. They obscure themselves with the hoods and the smoke, and they really engage in this kind of sorcerous art, and it's beautiful.
It is.
So Gast actually designed a cover for a collaborative album they did with Scott Walker. So this is the
Mhm.
cover that he created. I just thought it was really beautiful,
Great
and
album, by the way.
and this is a clip from a work that he did with Stephen O'Malley from Sun, and you can find this on his website if you go to the section called Tempestari, Tempestari. And it's a long piece. It's like 45 minutes, but it's really beautiful. And I found myself kind of like meditating to it today. And I absolutely loved it. I highly recommend everyone go to Gast's website and check this out.
Definitely.
And then here is the pictures of Helvet, talking about black metal theory. And I know like black metal has really kind of engaged in this antinomian, anti-life, dark kind of magic practice since day one. And I know you are been truly impacted by this musical scene in a deeply profound way. So what do you have to say about black metal?
Black metal, one of my favorite forms of art. It's very subversive in the sense that it challenges norms of what aesthetics are, and the ugliness of a lot of the production of traditional black metal, and the quite often unorthodox song structures, odd tunings, things like this, to challenge really sonically what music means. Even the vocals, these anguished sort of cries, and the corpse paint, creating an other. They're really creating a new image, an image of terror and death, to cast these like spells almost.
And we need to talk too, because black metal gets a really bad rep, but it's quite a variety of ideas and images.
It
I know
is.
Talking with you, you're far more interested in the black metal. It's still radically chaotic and anti-Christian, anti-norm, but you're more engaged with the depressive, suicidal, and antinomian forms of it, and the alienness of it, where it's trying to create these other landscapes, this radical, chaotic otherness that's meant to confront you with pain and depression,
Yeah.
visceral kind of tragic overcoming, right?
I really, with a lot of DSBM or depressive suicidal black metal, there can be a lot of like reveling in the pain of existence. Whereas I tend to love artists like Zaster and other artists like that, where they're saying, or Oftrikia, they're one of my favorite artists, where they're saying, look at my pain. They're not saying I'm reveling in it, but they're saying I'm in it and I don't know how to get out.
Right.
Or maybe they're saying, here's a way out. Sometimes. And usually the way out is in.
Yeah, it's embracing
descending
it, right?
into the darkness, mirroring the external darkness with your internal darkness, and finding, merging those things and becoming one with that chaos.
Truly expressing it in an artistic creation, and through this creation, expelling it from the self and overcoming. It's really reminds me of the creation of tragedy, and it's such a beautiful. It's beautiful in its ugliness,
It's ugly, but it's beautiful. There's the emotional excess. There's a great documentary, Until the Light Takes Us, and they interview an artist. I can't remember his name. I wish I could recall it from the vaults of my memory. But he talks a lot about comparing black metal to Edvard Munch's work, where at the time of Edvard Munch's creations, he was dealing with this intense death and disease and emotional excess that was not very accepted at the time in art, and it was very profound because of that.
And I find that it's really interesting with black metal that they were able to create their own language and their own landscape in order to engage with and have this almost ritual type production that then becomes imitated and riffed upon. I really love that about niche music in general, whether it's punk rock or ska and reggae. In my life, ska and reggae played such a huge importance. Engaging with radical sound systems, seeing that radical inclusiveness and that willingness in the ska scene to do battle with fascism and to directly challenge it. A lot of people are now removed from this, but when I was engaging with this as a young person, like there were actual like fist fights between so-called rude boy skinheads and neo-Nazi skinheads, and to the outsider they look the same, but they couldn't be more opposed, you know. And
Mm-hmm.
and also just the radical accepting of this of you know, in Canada we live in this multicultural society, and trying to create something that was truly embracing that multiculturalism and embracing these different forms and incorporating them, you know. It's seeing that revelry of punk but combining it with this, with the Caribbean ideals. And this was something that I really was foundational for me as a young person, so I related to what Gast was saying there. And just going
Mm-hmm.
back to the answer, I wanted to talk about, you know, just this, where was it? You know, trying to like this. Also, I wanted to engage with this idea about artists abandoning this kind of work, or not being able to persist, or not actually fully committing. You know, one thing that truly sets Gast apart is something like that Satanic Earth or Metamorphic Earth, where he took the 5 years. He went to the volcanoes of Iceland. He cast the curse upon the London art scene. He created the photographs and the way in which to present it and to observe it. Like, that's something that's true, creative, and powerful. And this is something that I really was impressed with your work, because you're actually putting yourself out there and creating poetry when other people aren't doing that, you know. And it's this active engagement that is so necessary.
In House of Leaves by Mark Z. Danielewski, he says the root of passion is labor. It's
Wow.
work. It's work to create. It's work to live. It's work to change yourself. It's work to survive. It's work to create to create magic, to create art. You know, you have to put in the effort and the time.
It has to be born of both love and suffering, you
Hmm.
know. That passion is truly that, you know, the art is both it's a labor, it's a reflection of suffering, but it's also a creation of love and a desire to communicate. And it's such a profound experience, and then it needs to be fully engaged with. And sorceress art even more so, because it is not about the about accolades. It's not about achieving money or fame or
No.
prestige or any of that kind of stuff, right? It's truly about this transformation of your world and of yourself. And no one is going to praise you for this. Maybe some will, but it's not going to ever be
But the
mainstream.
praise isn't the point.
No.
You know, the point is to transform.
Yeah. The point is to transform. The point is to transform. So now we come to our last question, which is, what advice would you give to sorcerers and artists who wish to engage similar practices to yourself? I think this one speaks for itself.
Hmm. Think deeply about the materials you are working with, and allow yourself to be guided by the currents and forces. Be bold and spontaneous, but also patient and, above all, persistent. It takes a lifetime to create the magnum opus, and you must be able to separate what moves you forward from what holds you back. It sounds banal, but many artists fail to make this distinction. I would advise young practitioners to inform themselves comprehensively and not to get too comfortable in the occult ghetto. Question occult ideas and measure them against scientific findings and philosophical considerations that deviate from what you are obviously interested in. And if you are into assault sorcery, put yourself in your opponent's head and think their thoughts. Only then will you be able to find the strategies with which you can attack them. Become the art you create, and let your art become who you are. Be ambitious, but remain humble as a human being and empathetic towards all other living creatures in this world. And never forget that materiality is the master, and you are only the channel through which it expresses itself.
What a profound and beautiful answer. And he kind of touches on all the different aspects. What do you think, Graham?
So I think, oh man, there's so much to unpack, but I really love his statement. It takes a lifetime to create the magnum opus, you know? So it goes back to what I was saying earlier about my poetry really just being practice and not a grand work, you know? I don't consider it like this magical, profound thing I've created. It's an attempt at a profound, magical thing, but I don't think I really succeed in that. You know, I think maybe I could go my whole lifetime without actually accomplishing that, and that's okay.
I also, when I think about that, I also think about the fact that even when you do create the magnum opus, it's not even about the final creation or the moment of
No,
creation, but it's about the life you lived in which to create that art. True art comes from the living being, and it comes from the reception of the totality of experience.
exactly. And also, you know, be ambitious but remain humble as a human being and empathetic towards all other living creatures. You know, it's all about, he says in Anarch, be powerful without becoming dominant.
Yes, right? Be powerful in and of the self, right? If we're truly
But be
doing our
humble.
will, if we're truly doing our will harm none. And yeah, and be humble. Don't see yourself as some grand power that can lord over others. That's, as soon as you start to do that, you're missing the entire point, and you're only inviting doom upon yourself.
If you claim if you claim to be enlightened, you probably aren't.
Right? And also, I really love this idea too. Question occult ideas and measure them against scientific findings and philosophical considerations that deviate from what you are obviously interested in. This is something that
Mm-mm.
really hits hard to me. And I just want to read one of my favorite quotes, which is from Cicero on the nature of God. Cicero was one of the people who rebelled against Caesar and tried to maintain the republic. And even though he failed in stopping the tyrant, he was right, and history will exonerate him, I believe. And he was also just a deeply profound person. He was someone who was initiated into many different occult schools. Famously, he was initiated into the cult of Pythagoras, and he was deeply critical of Pythagoreanism because of its obsession with the master and this deviation, in this codifying and obsessing over what he said and trying to follow him to the letter. So I wanted to read this quote from Cicero, where he says, "For the force of reason in disputation is to be sought after rather than authority, since the authority of the teacher is often a disadvantage to those who are willing to learn, as they refuse to use their own judgment and rely implicitly on him whom they make choice of for a preceptor." The teacher can offer you a lot, but you can't allow that person to circumvent your own reasoning, your own judgment, and your own experience. Everything has to come back to the self, to the individual, and it's up to you to do the hard work of finding the truth, of finding what is truly meaningful. And if you just listen to others, you're eventually going to be lied to, or you're going to be led down a limited path. You cannot, this is something I fundamentally believe. We cannot have the experiences of someone else, no matter what these people tell you. If you go into the cave and you do what the Buddha did and you obsess over it, you will not achieve enlightenment like he did. I don't believe it, not for 1 second. Even
No.
if you achieve something like enlightenment, it's your own unique perception of such, right? And you can learn from these individuals, learn from many, and even take someone on as maybe a master to teach you a skill for a time. But remember to question them and not accept anything as dogma. Dogma is limitation, it's a lie.
Mm-mm.
Everything is fundamentally in flux. In our current states, we cannot perceive the absolute truth. We can only perceive aspects of the truth, things that are true within the moment, within the body. But the fundamental reality of our nature, of the world, is denied to us. We cannot understand the material. It is beyond conception, just as non-being is beyond conception. And we have to accept these limitations and laugh in the face of the absurdity and persist anyway, you know?
Definitely. You know, I think a lot about that brings to mind a lot of what you're saying. In modern medical sciences, with like, you go to medical school and then you shadow a doctor and you almost have an impression of that doctor sort of pressed onto you, you know. And it's like, in the ideal situation, the student can question the doctor's practices, and the doctor can say, you know, maybe you're right, or well, this is why I think this might be the right decision, but that's you know what I mean. But many people are traditionalists, and they're grounded in that, and they will try to spread their traditionalist views onto their students, and then that perpetuates this sort of like stagnant medical view, you know. Whereas like I have a close friend, and they had a doctor and an apprentice, a student, and the student said, well, maybe it's actually this, and the doctor said, no, it can't be that, that's impossible. And then about a month later, they had a follow-up, and the doctor said, you were absolutely right, it was that, I was wrong. And he was humble and admitted his wrongdoing and praised the student. And that is the ideal. That is the ideal, but that's not what we see. Anyways, that just made me think of that, because I know lots of people that have gone to med school and stuff, and this is often a criticism.
That was a great aside, and it relates to you personally, because as we've talked about on here, you were misdiagnosed for years, and people refused to listen to you, and you had to go do your own research and convince people to take you seriously before you could get your diagnosis. Yeah. And so this is something that it's visceral, and we need to challenge authority. Authority only can go so far. You're only an expert until you're not, you know?
Exactly.
Yeah, but yeah, this was a really profound interview. I absolutely loved getting these in-depth answers from Gast. And, you know, we'll leave with his final line here. And never forget that materiality is the master, and you are only the channel through which it expresses itself. It's up to create art. You have to channel the divine and be possessed by it. Live within the body and use the body as a tool and an extension, you know, and use the material world around you. Love it, love it, love it, love it. Any final words?
I think that's a perfect way to leave it off.
All right, please, everyone, go to the links below. We have links to Graham's work. You can find all of Graham's poetry at thingsinmychest.com. You're getting ready to release your latest work. Do you want to talk about that for a moment?
Sure, I'll briefly talk about it. It's called Sacred Armaments, Essential for Vanquishing Psychiatric Demons. And it was composed in one night a couple weeks ago. And it is very much about the failure of the medical system and how I've had to literally rely on sorcery to keep myself alive.
Wow. I don't need to say anything else. We did a whole entire episode upon this work. It is truly a beautiful piece. You can go look that up on our live section. And we have an upcoming episode that we're going to be doing on the 30th. We're taking a break for the holiday, but we're going to be doing Jeremy Reed, and this is your choice. Do you want to talk about Jeremy Reed?
It is. So we'll be discussing The House of the Dead. I have it right here, by Jeremy Reed. And it is a reinvention of books 10 and 11 of Homer's Odyssey in a reimagined in like a sci-fi slam poetry invocation of necromantic rites and psychotropic drugs.
I'm so excited for this one. You showed me some clips from it, and he full on just calls Tiresias trans, and he full on talks about the psychedelic drugs that Odysseus needs to use in order to enter the underworld. And these are things that we talk about in academia, but they're not present in the text. They're metaphoric and analog. So I'm really excited.
He brings a lot of these elements of the mysteries into the forefront.
Right.
And in addition to the traditional heroes that Odysseus encounters in the underworld, there are many modern heroes or dragons that we could call them that he encounters as well. One of them being Artaud himself.
I love that. You know, and if, for those of us who know us, they know how much Artaud means to us and to this show. So look forward to that on December 30th. So I'll just end with, please go support Gast. They have been an incredibly lovely person. We've developed a friendship and a collaborative working with them, and we truly love their support and the incredible art that they've produced. You can go right now and purchase their work Anarch. It is available. I'm just going to bring up the picture here. Oops. You can buy it right now on Scarlet Imprint, and it is well worth the money. This is a truly magical text, and it is filled to the brim with art, philosophy, and poetry. You have a copy, do you not?
Each paragraph in it, you could spend it more than a day contemplating.
Right? It's a deep meditative work, and you can even engage with these. All of these art pieces are living works of art or sorcerous creation. You can engage with them in a transformative, meditative way and be possessed by them. You know, engage with this piece. It is well worth it. You can also go to the links below, and you'll see links to Gast's website where you can see his live videos that we were talking about that he did with Stephen O'Malley. And you can also engage with him on Instagram. He will talk to you. You leave a comment on his art, and he may even follow you. He's a very connected on there, and he's a lovely person. So thank you, Gast, for all of your questions, for the profound work you have done with Anarch, and for allowing us to enter into your sorceress woods. Really loved it. It was an amazing experience, and we hope to collaborate with you again in the future. So much love to Gast. Any final words?
You said it the best.
All right.
Thank you, Gast.
Peace, love. Hail Satan. Join us on December 30th. Take care, everyone.